Welcome back. We're picking up where we left off.
Yeah, we are.
And today we are moving into the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, specifically looking at the returning community of Judah.
Right.
So just to establish our textual boundaries right up front, we are looking strictly at Ezra chapter 1 through chapter 6 today.
Exactly. We are intentionally holding Ezra chapters 7 through 10 and the entirety of Nehemiah for our subsequent deep dives.
Yeah, we need to pace ourselves with this material. So to give you a clear roadmap of how we're approaching this today, we're going to proceed in a very specific order.
Right.
First, we'll establish a narrative and historical overview of the return from Babylon up to the completion of the temple under the Persian king Darius.
And then second, we'll transition into the scholarly framing of these chapters, really looking at the composite nature of the text itself.
Right. Third, we are going to analyze the reality of Persian imperial policy and, compare that against the biblical presentation of the Cyrus decree.
Fourth, we'll tackle that notorious chronological dislocation that happens in Ezra chapter 4.
Yeah, that one is a headache. Fifth, we will trace the early theological formation of a remnant identity within this returning community.
And finally, we'll wrap up with an LDS devotional reflection, tying this history directly to the themes you are reading in faith. Come follow me.
Perfect. So let's jump right in.
Yeah, we really should start by setting the historical stage because the geopolitical landscape of the ancient Near East had just undergone a massive realignment.
Yeah, complete upheaval.
Exactly. The year is 539 BC. So for context, the Neo-Babylonian Empire had been the uncontested superpower of the region for a long time.
Right. This is the same empire that had devastated the kingdom of Judah.
Yes. They leveled the city of Jerusalem. They completely destroyed Solomon's temple in 586 BC, and that triggered the Babylonian exile.
But then suddenly, by 539 BC, that Babylonian dominance just collapses.
It does. Cyrus the Great, who was the king of the rising Persian Empire, he basically marches on Babylon.
And the way that conquest happens, it completely defies the usual expectations of ancient warfare, right?
Oh, absolutely.
If you look at the Nabonidus Chronicle, which is this Babylonian historical text that records the events of the period, Babylon falls to Cyrus essentially without a battle.
Right. It's wild. And Nabonidus, the final king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, he'd spent years away from the capital.
Yeah, out in Tima, right.
Exactly. And he had heavily alienated the local Babylonian priesthood by neglecting the traditional religious festivals.
So because of that internal friction, Cyrus is largely just able to walk into this massive, heavily fortified capital city and take over.
Yeah, a bloodless transition of power at the absolute center of the world.
And that sudden shift marks the definitive end of the Babylonian exile for the Judahites.
Because Cyrus initiates this sweeping imperial policy that sets the entirety of the book of Ezra in motion.
Right. He issues a decree allowing displaced peoples to return to their ancestral homelands and restore their local religious cults.
But I think we really have to pause here and consider the human reality of what that decree actually meant for the Judahites living in exile.
Oh yeah, the human element is crucial here.
Right, because by 539 BC, nearly 50 years had passed since the destruction of Jerusalem.
A whole lifetime in the ancient world.
Exactly. The generation that had been violently deported in 586 BC was, well, for the most part, entirely gone.
Right. The people hearing Cyrus's decree were primarily their children or even their grandchildren.
Yeah. They had been born in Babylon. They grew up in Babylon.
In Babylon in the mid-6th century BC, it was a staggering cosmopolitan metropolis.
It was. It was highly functioning, wealthy, a sophisticated imperial center.
It had massive defensive walls. You had the Euphrates River running directly through it, thriving agricultural networks.
Right, and a bustling international economy where we actually know from external archaeological evidence that many Judahites had become quite successful.
Yeah, they were doing well for themselves. So if you were one of those Judahites, you were deeply embedded in that society.
You have a life there.
And then you look at what awaited you back in the province of Judah.
Right, the contrast is stark.
Jerusalem was utterly desolate. It had been in ruins for a half-century. The defensive walls were breached and broken down. All the municipal infrastructure was just gone.
Yeah, the agricultural terraces on the hillsides had completely eroded away.
And the temple itself was nothing but scattered, charred stone.
So when we read the decree of Cyrus offering them this opportunity to go back, we really cannot read it as some easy, joyous vacation home.
No, not at all.
To return to Jerusalem meant choosing extreme physical scarcity, constant danger, and multi-generational hardship over the only stable, prosperous life they had ever known.
And the text makes it clear that only a minority of the population actually chose to accept that hardship, right?
Yeah, a very small group, comparatively. The group that departs under the leadership of a man named Sheshbazzar, who is designated as a prince of Judah, numbers somewhere between 40 and 50,000 people.
Which, in the context of the larger diaspora, is a very small remnant.
Right, they are voluntarily leaving the apex of civilization to go inhabit a ruin.
And when they finally arrive after that grueling journey, they find themselves in what the Persian administration now designates as the province of Yehud.
Yeah, Yehud. It is a thinly populated, deeply impoverished shadow of the former pre-exilic kingdom of Judah.
Furthermore, it's surrounded by neighboring peoples who have spent the last 50 years expanding into that territorial vacuum left by the Babylonian deportation.
Exactly, the neighbors had moved in. And the first priority of this returning minority, it is incredibly telling.
Yeah, because they don't immediately start building houses for themselves.
Wow.
And they don't even start by laying the foundation of a new temple right away.
Right. The very first collective act they undertake is to clear the rubble and rebuild the altar of the God of Israel on its original historic site.
They reinstitute the daily sacrifices. They resume the cycle of worship right there in the open air amid the absolute ruins of their former civilization.
And that decision to prioritize the altar, it really speaks to their profound need to reestablish cosmic order and re-anchor their covenant relationship before they even address their physical security.
Yeah, it's a powerful statement of priorities.
It is. The narrative then moves forward to the laying of the actual temple foundation, which produces one of the most complex emotional scenes in the Hebrew Bible.
I love this scene. The younger generation, the ones who had only ever known the flat plains of Babylon, they are shouting with absolute joy because a foundation is finally being laid.
Right, it's a victory for them.
But the older generation, the elders who had vague, lingering childhood memories of the scale and the grandeur of Solomon's original temple.
Yeah, they are weeping aloud when they see how modest this new foundation actually is.
And the text notes that the sound of the shouting and the sound of the weeping mingled together into a single noise that could be heard from far away.
It's such a striking image. It really highlights the intense friction between the reality of their impoverished present and the looming memory of their glorious past.
But even that modest progress is almost immediately halted, isn't it?
Yeah, it doesn't last long. Neighboring populations approach the returnees, and they offer to assist with the rebuilding.
But the leaders of the returned exiles firmly refuse the offer.
Right. And we're going to dig much deeper into the theological reasoning behind that refusal later in our discussion. But the immediate historical consequence is that these neighbors turn hostile.
They begin a coordinated campaign of intimidation.
Exactly. And they ultimately send accusations to the Persian court, claiming that if Jerusalem is allowed to rebuild, it will inevitably become a rebellious city and cease paying tribute to the empire.
Which is the one thing the Persian Empire cares about.
Right, tribute. And that political maneuvering proves highly effective. The Persian administration orders a halt to the construction, and the project just stagnates for nearly 2 decades.
2 decades. So from the reign of Cyrus all the way through the reign of his successor Cambyses, the temple site sits exactly as it was.
Yeah, just an unfinished stone foundation surrounded by poverty and political hostility.
And it is not until the year 520 BC, which is during the second year of the reign of the Persian king Darius I, that the narrative shifts again.
Right, and this is where we see prophetic pressure enter the historical record.
2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, emerge within the community.
And Haggai's message is incredibly blunt.
Yeah, he essentially shames the populace, asking how they can justify living in their own paneled houses while the house of the Lord lies in ruins.
He forces the community to confront this uncomfortable reality, that they have prioritized their own physical survival and domestic comfort over their covenant obligations to God.
And inspired, or frankly chastised by these prophets, the political governor Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua resume the work on the temple in direct defiance of that decades-long stagnation.
Right. But resuming the work immediately triggers an administrative response from the empire.
Of course it does.
Yeah, Tatnai, who is the regional Persian governor overseeing the entire massive territory west of the Euphrates River, he travels directly to Jerusalem to investigate.
He demands to know who authorized this construction. He records the names of the leaders and sends an official inquiry back to King Darius in the Persian capital.
And Darius receives the letter and orders a search of the royal archives.
Which is just standard bureaucratic procedure, right?
Exactly. And remarkably, they locate a scroll in the fortress of Ecbatana containing the original decree of Cyrus authorizing the temple project.
So Darius not only confirms the Judahites' legal right to build, but he issues a new decree ordering Tatnai to actively fund the project out of the royal treasury, drawn from the taxes of the surrounding region.
Yeah, the enemies end up footing the bill.
It's incredible. And with this renewed imperial backing, the temple is finally completed in 516 BC.
It is dedicated with joy, and the community immediately celebrates the Passover, which serves as a deliberate narrative marker echoing the exodus from Egypt and signaling a new era of covenant life.
That brings us to the completion of the narrative arc for these first 6 chapters.
Right.
But this is the point where we need to pivot our approach. Because if you read Ezra 1 through 6 purely as a smooth, continuous historical story, you miss the actual mechanics of the text.
Yeah, exactly. This is not a seamless narrative like the history of David's rise in the books of Samuel.
It's very different.
It is fundamentally a composite text. It is a documentary collage.
Right.
The final editor has taken a wide variety of independent materials, royal decrees, official administrative correspondence, demographic lists, and genealogical records, and stitched them all together using narrative bridges designed to hold these disparate pieces into a single framework.
So to truly understand what Ezra 1 through 6 is doing, we have to examine it through 4 distinct analytical lenses.
Right.
We must evaluate the authenticity and structural arrangement of these compiled documents. We must analyze the historical reality of Persian imperial policy compared to the text's theological claims.
We must resolve a massive chronological problem embedded in Chapter 4.
And we must examine how the editor uses these documents to establish the theological boundaries of restored Israel.
Yeah, so let us examine that first analytical lens, the composition of Ezra 1 through 6.
Okay, let's do it.
If you deconstruct this collage, the scenes between the documents become very apparent.
Very obvious, yeah.
Chapter 1 contains a Hebrew version of the Cyrus decree and an exact itemized inventory of the temple vessels that were returned.
Then Chapter 2 is a massive demographic list of the settlers who returned from exile.
Right. Chapters 3 and the beginning of 4 are a Hebrew narrative detailing the building of the altar, the laying of the foundation, and the initial opposition.
But then, right at Ezra 4, verse 8, something highly unusual happens.
Yeah, it really jumps out at you.
The text abruptly shifts from Hebrew into Aramaic, and it stays in Aramaic all the way through the end of Chapter 6.
And that shift to Aramaic is one of the most critical structural features of the entire book.
Why is that?
Because Aramaic was the administrative language of the Persian Empire. Any official correspondence between a provincial governor like Tatnai and the royal court of Darius would have been drafted, transmitted, and archived by the scribal chancellery in Aramaic.
But if you are an ancient editor compiling a text for a Hebrew-speaking religious community, why would you leave massive blocks of text in Aramaic instead of just translating them into Hebrew to match the rest of the book?
It's a great question.
I mean, it's like reading a modern memoir that's flowing nicely in English, and suddenly the author just copy-pastes 20 pages of dense legal PDFs into the middle of the book in a different language.
Yeah.
It completely jolts the reader. It feels like a deliberate choice to force the reader to interact with the raw material itself.
It is entirely deliberate. H.G.M. Williamson, in his volume for the Word Biblical Commentary series on Ezra Nehemiah, he argues that this shift to Aramaic marks the exact point where the biblical editor is drawing directly upon an official chancellery source.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, by leaving the material in its original administrative language, the editor is asserting a strict documentary authenticity.
Like saying, look at the primary source.
Exactly. The Aramaic language itself signals to the reader, this is the official imperial record, this is not just our own internal community narrative, these are the actual receipts.
That concept of presenting the receipts is essential here. But, while Williamson highlights the authenticity of the underlying source documents, we also have to consider how those documents are being utilized by the editor.
Right.
Because Bob Becking, who is a scholar of the Persian period, he strongly urges caution regarding how we read this compilation.
What does he say?
Becking argues that while the underlying administrative material, the Aramaic letters and decrees, may be completely genuine, its final, edited, reordered form cannot be treated as straightforward, objective history.
Ah, I see.
The editor has taken genuine documents and arranged them to serve a very specific rhetorical purpose.
All right, so if we view Ezra 1 through 6 not as a simple history textbook, but as an apologetic legal brief, its structure makes perfect sense.
A legal brief, yeah.
The returned community is surrounded by hostile neighbors who are constantly accusing them of sedition and rebellion.
Their whole existence is politically precarious.
Exactly. Therefore, the compiler of Ezra gathers the Cyrus decree, the Tatnai correspondence, and the Darius decree, and arranges them to form an ironclad legal defense.
Right.
The text is designed to demonstrate to any external authority, or honestly any internal doubter, that their presence in the land is entirely legal.
The temple is authorized by the crown. The documents are presented to prove it.
Precisely. And alongside that official correspondence, we have to look at the settler list in Chapter 2.
Right, the census.
Yeah, this detailed census of the families who returned from exile. And what makes this list so central to the debate over the composition of the text is that it appears, again, almost verbatim in the book of Nehemiah.
Specifically in Nehemiah chapter 7.
Yes. And this massive repetition forces scholars to ask whether Ezra and Nehemiah were originally written as a single continuous work by one author, or if they were independent texts that were later joined together.
And the scholarly division on this point is sharp, right?
Very sharp. On one hand, scholars like J.C. Vanderkam argue that the wholesale repetition of such a massive list strongly suggests that Ezra and Nehemiah were originally distinct, independent books.
Because if a single author were writing a continuous history from the time of Cyrus all the way down to Nehemiah, there would be no logical reason to insert the exact same exhaustive census list twice in two different contexts.
Right, it wouldn't make sense structurally. But on the other hand, scholars like Tamar Eskenazi argue the exact opposite.
What's her take?
She suggests that the repetition is actually a highly sophisticated literary device. In her view, the list acts as a deliberate structural bracket.
Oh, like bookends.
Yes. It appears at the beginning of the restoration in Ezra 2, and again at the consolidation of the community in Nehemiah 7, deliberately unifying the entire Ezra-Nehemiah corpus into a single, cohesive narrative architecture.
Well, regardless of whether you view the repetition as evidence of separate books or a unified literary structure, the narrative through line of these chapters relies entirely on the premise that the Persian Empire authorized this project.
Absolutely.
If the text is utilizing official Persian documents as a legal brief, we really must evaluate the historical reality of the primary document upon which the entire return is based, which is the decree of Cyrus the Great.
Right. And to do that, we move to our second analytical lens, comparing the biblical presentation of Persian imperial policy against the external historical record.
And the most important artifact for this comparison is the Cyrus Cylinder.
Yes, discovered in the late 19th century in the ruins of Babylon.
It's this barrel-shaped clay cylinder covered in Akkadian cuneiform, right?
Yeah, the standard wedge-shaped writing system used for administrative and royal texts in Mesopotamia.
And it was essentially a foundation deposit buried in the walls of Babylon to commemorate Cyrus's conquest of the city.
And the contents of the Cyrus Cylinder are incredibly revealing.
They really are.
The text is steeped in formulaic Mesopotamian royal ideology. It describes Cyrus as being chosen, guided, and legitimized by Marduk, the chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon.
Right. According to the Cylinder, Marduk was angry with the former Babylonian king Nabonidus for his religious neglect, and so Marduk called Cyrus to march on Babylon and restore proper worship.
And the Cylinder explicitly details how Cyrus returned various sacred statues of gods to their original sanctuaries across Mesopotamia, and how he gathered the displaced populations and returned them to their homelands to rebuild their local temples.
But what the Cyrus Cylinder does not say is just as important as what it does say.
Exactly.
Because it does not mention Judah, it does not mention Jerusalem, it does not mention Yahweh, and it does not mention the Jewish temple.
No, not at all. What it does is establish the broader imperial policy of the Achaemenid Empire.
Because the biblical narrative in Ezra 1 claims that Cyrus issued a decree specifically for the Judahites, allowing them to rebuild their temple.
Right, and even quoting Cyrus as acknowledging Yahweh as the God of heaven who gave him all the kingdoms of the earth.
And for a long time, readers assumed this meant Cyrus had some unique, enlightened affinity for the Jewish people, or a specific reverence for the God of Israel.
Yeah, that popular devotional assumption paints Cyrus as a monotheist sympathizer who recognized the truth of Israel's God.
But the external evidence of the Cyrus Cylinder corrects that assumption completely.
It does. The historian's consensus is clear. Cyrus's decree regarding Jerusalem was not an act of unique religious tolerance. It was an act of highly calculated imperial administration.
Right. Rebuilding the local temples of conquered peoples was just a standard tactic.
An empire as vast as Persia could not afford to govern solely by military force and intimidation. It was far cheaper and far more effective to secure the loyalty of subject populations by presenting the Persian king as the benevolent restorer of their local traditions.
The patron of their local gods.
Exactly. By authorizing and funding the temple in Jerusalem, Cyrus was essentially purchasing the compliance and stability of the Yehud province.
He was acting as a pure pragmatist. But recognizing this historical reality highlights the absolute brilliance of the biblical author's theological overlay.
Oh, completely.
Because the writer of Ezra doesn't attempt to hide the fact that Cyrus is a foreign pagan emperor. The text freely acknowledges his foreignness.
Yes.
But the biblical author makes a staggeringly bold theological claim that standard-issue Persian imperial policy, driven by economic and political pragmatism, is actually being dictated by the sovereign God of Israel.
Right. The text claims that when Cyrus acts out of statecraft, he is, in reality, serving as an instrument of Yahweh to fulfill the prophecies of Jeremiah regarding the end of the exile.
So the historiography itself is a profound theological argument that Israel's God directs the movements and the policies of empires.
It's brilliant. And we see the reality of that massive imperial structure playing out perfectly in the narrative of Tatnai's investigation in Chapter 5.
Because the Persian Empire was divided into massive administrative zones called satrapies.
Right, and Judah was just a tiny sub-province within a vast satrapy, officially designated as beyond the river.
Which encompassed everything west of the Euphrates all the way down to the border of Egypt.
Yeah, it was huge. And Tatnai was the governor of that entire massive satrapy.
So when Tatnai sees the temple being built in Jerusalem, he follows standard Achaemenid bureaucratic protocol to the letter.
He doesn't immediately march an army in and slaughter the builders.
No, he interrogates them, he records their claims of prior royal authorization, and he sends an official dispatch up the bureaucratic chain of command to King Darius to verify the claim against the royal archives.
The administrative reality depicted in this specific section of the text is remarkably accurate to what we know of Persian governance and record-keeping.
It really is. But while Tatnai's investigation aligns perfectly with the administration of Darius, the narrative leading up to that investigation contains a glaring historical and administrative dislocation.
A huge one.
And this brings us to our third analytical lens, the chronological puzzle sitting right in the middle of Ezra chapter 4.
Right. This is an issue that has frustrated careful readers of the Bible for centuries.
We have to map the anachronism out clearly to understand what the editor's doing here.
Yeah, so the sequence of Persian kings in actual history is well documented and universally agreed upon.
We have external records for this.
Lots of them. Cyrus the Great ruled from 559 to 530 BC. He was followed by his son Cambyses, and then by Darius I, who rules from 522 to 486 BC.
Okay, Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius.
Right. Darius was followed by Ahasuerus, who is universally identified by historians as Xerxes, ruling from 486 to 465 BC.
Xerxes, got it.
Xerxes was then followed by Artaxerxes I, who ruled from 465 to 424 BC.
So that is the unbroken historical timeline. Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes.
Now look at how Ezra chapter 4 presents the timeline of opposition to the rebuilding of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
In verse 5, the text says the adversaries frustrated the building plans throughout the reign of Cyrus, down to the reign of Darius.
Which makes perfect chronological sense.
It does. But then in verse 6, the text suddenly says that in the reign of Ahasuerus, which is Xerxes, the enemies wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah.
Okay, so it jumped forward.
And then in verse 7, it jumps forward again in time, detailing a lengthy correspondence written during the days of Artaxerxes.
Right, the text gives us the full Aramaic letter sent to Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes' reply ordering the work in Jerusalem to stop.
And here is where the sequence completely breaks down. After detailing this correspondence with Artaxerxes, who reigned deep into the mid-5th century BC, chapter 4 concludes in verse 24 by saying, "Then the work on the house of God in Jerusalem stopped, and it was discontinued until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia."
Wait, so the text jumps forward to Xerxes and Artaxerxes and then abruptly jumps backward in time by several decades to Darius.
Exactly.
Furthermore, if you look closely at the text of the letter sent to Artaxerxes in verses 12 through 16, the dispute isn't even about the temple. The enemies are warning Artaxerxes that the Jews are rebuilding the city walls and the foundations of the city itself.
And historically, the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem did not occur until the time of Nehemiah, which was precisely during the reign of Artaxerxes I, long after the temple had already been completed under Darius.
So we have a text about wall building in the mid-5th century dropped right into the middle of a narrative about temple building in the late 6th century.
It's a mess chronologically. And for a long time, there were attempts by older commentators to resolve this by renaming the kings.
How so?
They tried to argue that the Ahasuerus and Artaxerxes mentioned in Ezra 4 were actually just alternate names for earlier, lesser-known rulers who reigned before Darius, like Cambyses or the brief usurper Bardia.
But we must discard those older solutions, right?
We have to. They have virtually no support in modern scholarship, because the names Ahasuerus and Artaxerxes clearly and linguistically correspond to the later kings Xerxes and Artaxerxes.
So the modern scholarly consensus is much more intellectually satisfying because it respects the intelligence of the final editor.
Yes.
The editor of Ezra was not confused about the order of the Persian kings. Rather, the editor deliberately abandoned strict chronological sequencing in favor of a thematic grouping.
Exactly. In Ezra chapter 4, the editor has gathered together various historical records of opposition to Jerusalem records spanning nearly a century and clustered them all into one single chapter.
It functions as a literary flash forward.
It does. The editor is pausing the chronological narrative of the temple to make a sweeping rhetorical argument.
The argument being that the opposition they faced was not just a temporary misunderstanding under Cyrus.
Right. It was a persistent, multi-generational, relentless hostility that spanned the reigns of Cyrus, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes.
And after establishing that thematic point, the editor brackets that section and returns the narrative to its chronological place in the reign of Darius in chapter 5 to finish the story of the temple.
We should explicitly connect this compositional choice to the historiographical techniques we discussed when we looked at the books of Chronicles.
Yeah, non-chronological, argument-driven arrangement of historical texts is a known, established precedent in Second Temple literature.
The authors of this era felt entirely comfortable prioritizing theological and thematic arguments over strict linear timelines. They are organizing history by meaning, not just by date.
But we need to explicitly flag this chronological flexibility because this textual reality in Ezra 4 plants the seed for a massive debate that we will have to confront in our next deep dive.
Oh, absolutely.
In Ezra chapter 7, the text says that Ezra himself arrived in Jerusalem during the reign of Artaxerxes.
Right. But because of the way the editor has already demonstrated a willingness to group things thematically rather than chronologically, a major scholarly debate has raged for over a century regarding which Artaxerxes this is.
Did Ezra arrive under Artaxerxes I in 458 BC, or did he arrive under Artaxerxes II in 398 BC?
And if it is the latter, it would mean Ezra actually arrived in Jerusalem decades after Nehemiah, completely reversing the traditional biblical sequence.
We will definitely hold the details of that debate for next time, but the root of the problem is established right here in the editorial methods of Chapter 4.
Yeah, it starts right here. And this thematic grouping of opposition in Chapter 4 isn't just about external political enemies. It is intrinsically tied to the internal question of who actually has the right to build.
Which leads us directly into our fourth analytical lens, the early shape of remnant identity.
We need to look closely at how this community is defining itself, because the theological boundaries they draw here will have massive consequences later on.
Right, and we can see this identity formation starting back in the settler list in Chapter 2.
When you read that long list of names and numbers, it is so easy to dismiss it as just an administrative headcount.
Just a dry census.
But practically, it functions as a strict boundary marker. The list categorizes people by their ancestral houses and their hereditary lineages.
And the text specifically highlights a crisis among the priests.
Yeah, there were individuals who claimed to be of priestly descent, but when the genealogical records were searched, their names could not be found.
And the consequence for lacking that documentation is severe. They are deemed unclean and are strictly barred from participating in the priesthood or eating the most holy food until a high priest with Urim and Thummim could arise to divine their true status.
Think about what a strikingly high bar for legitimacy that is.
It's incredibly high.
The community has just crossed hundreds of miles of desert to a ruined city. They desperately need leadership and organization to survive, and yet they are willing to turn away willing priests simply because they lack the genealogical paperwork.
Legitimacy in this restored community is tied absolutely to verified lineage, not merely to self-identification or a willingness to serve.
Right. And that insistence on bounded identity escalates dramatically in Chapter 4 during the initial opposition we talked about.
Yeah, the text describes a group of people called the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin.
These people approach Zerubbabel and the leaders the returnees, and they make what sounds like a very reasonable request.
They ask to participate in the rebuilding of the temple.
And they justify their request by claiming, "We seek your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here."
So these are people who have been living in the land for generations, ever since the Assyrian deportations of the northern kingdom of Israel.
Yeah, they claim to worship Yahweh. They want to help build the temple.
But Zerubbabel's response is a flat, uncompromising, absolute refusal.
He says, "You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us."
We must address the profound discomfort of this text.
Yeah, it's a tough passage.
The biblical narrative here is not providing neutral reportage of a historical event. The text completely endorses Zerubbabel's strict boundary.
It does. The narrative defines the returning exiles, the specific lineage that went to Babylon and came back as the sole legitimate bearers of the covenant identity.
Anyone else, even those who claim to worship the same God and have lived in the land for centuries, is designated as an adversary.
And it is vital to point out that historians recognize these rejected populations in Ezra 4 as the historical precursors to the Samaritans.
Ah, the very group that will feature so prominently in the animosities of the New Testament era.
Exactly.
And this raises a massive tension within the biblical canon itself, a canonical fault line that you have to confront if you are reading closely.
Oh, absolutely.
How does a reader reconcile the strict genealogical exclusion demanded by Ezra with the theology presented in the book of Ruth?
It's a huge contrast.
In Ruth, you have a Moabite woman, a foreigner from a historically despised nation who is brought directly into the covenant community based entirely on her loyalty to her mother-in-law and to Israel's God.
Her inclusion is celebrated to the point that she becomes the great-grandmother of King David himself.
Right, so that tension is so pronounced that there's a significant ongoing scholarly debate over the dating and purpose of the book of Ruth.
Many critical scholars argue that Ruth was actually composed, or at least heavily redacted, during this very post-exilic period.
Specifically to serve as a counter-argument to the exclusionary ideology being enforced by the Ezra-Nehemiah community.
Right. And whether Ruth was written as a direct polemic, or whether the tension simply reflects the diverse theological perspectives preserved within the canon, the conflict is undeniable.
We have to understand that this insistence on a bounded, genealogically verified remnant is baked into the restoration from the very start.
It is established at the foundation of the temple.
And setting the stage for crisis here is crucial, because if you understand the boundaries drawn in chapters 2 and 4, the dramatic, heartbreaking marriage dissolutions that we will encounter in Ezra chapters 9 and 10 become structurally inevitable.
Yeah, we will explore that crisis in depth during our next discussion. But for now, as we transition toward our concluding thoughts, we should shift our tone from critical analysis to a warmer, more personal reflection on what this history means for a covenant community today.
When you anchor this material in the themes of "Come, Follow Me," what stands out most vividly is the sheer smallness of these beginnings.
It really is striking.
You have 40,000 people who chose to leave comfort for a ruined city, and then their work simply stalls. For 20 years, the foundation sits there.
And they don't stop building because they suddenly hate God.
No.
They stop because the crushing, exhausting weight of daily survival, combined with relentless political hostility, just crowds the temple out.
It takes Haggai stepping in to ask that piercing question. Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses while this house lies in ruins?
It is very difficult not to see the natural, unforced parallels to the early days of the Latter-day Saint restoration.
Oh, the parallels are everywhere.
You have a small, marginalized, often impoverished community trying to build something sacred out of nothing.
Whether in Kirtland or Nauvoo, they faced constantly hostile neighbors who weaponized the legal and political systems against them, attempting to frame their religious project as a seditious threat to the state.
Their efforts frequently stalled out due to poverty and persecution, and it repeatedly required prophetic urgency to push the community to sacrifice their own stability to finish the work of the temple.
The sociology of the returned exiles maps remarkably well onto the lived experience of the early saints.
It really does. There is also a profoundly expansive theology embedded in how this text treats Cyrus the Great.
Yeah, think about it. Here's a pagan emperor, a man who worships Marduk and utilizes religion purely as a tool of statecraft.
And yet the biblical author sees God operating directly through him.
It is a powerful reminder that God's redemptive work frequently moves through instruments who do not fully comprehend the larger purposes they are serving.
Right. Jesus Christ's work in the world is not limited only to those who explicitly recognize his name.
Divine providence can utilize the bureaucracy of empires to facilitate the gathering of the covenant people.
Exactly. And the absolute center of gravity for all of this is the temple itself.
Everything we have discussed today, the demographic list, the imperial decrees, the political maneuvering, the decades of delay, the prophetic rebukes, it all exists entirely in service of getting a house of the Lord built.
Because the temple is the prerequisite for the resumption of covenant keeping.
And that resonates deeply with the modern Latter-day Saint understanding of temples. They are not merely architectural achievement.
No, they are the necessary gathering places for an imperfect, scattered, often discouraged people to continually reorient themselves toward their covenants with God.
I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, something that builds on everything we've unpacked today.
Okay.
Consider the possibility that the 20-year delay in building the temple, that period where the foundation lay bare and the people focused on their own survival, was not merely a political accident caused by hostile neighbors.
What if it wasn't an accident?
Right. What if that delay was actually a necessary period of refining for the returning exiles?
Sitting in the ruins of Jerusalem, forced to choose day after day between building their own paneled houses and prioritizing the Lord's house, may have been the exact crucible required to forge the strict, unyielding covenant identity they were going to need.
Because without that hardened sense of who they were, they likely would not have survived the existential crises of assimilation that we will explore in chapters 9 and 10.
That is a perspective that certainly reframes the decades of stagnation, not as a failure, but as a severe mercy.
Next time, we will introduce Ezra himself. We will dive into the complex chronology debate of chapter 7, and we will confront the devastating marriage crisis in chapters 9 and 10. We'll pick it up next time.